Hey, folks. So let's talk about temporary stacks with AWS CDK. Now, temporary stacks are big front and center when you're using serverless framework, but with AWS CDK, people really don't talk about them. And they're quite easy with serverless framework because the stage variable is there and they abstract that nicely, and that stage variable goes to all the cloud resources that you're concerned with immediately. That's what they know about it, right? And then that coupled with some serverless plugins to extract your environment variables easily out to your um, either your local environment or CI environment. It makes the entirety of temporary stacks very easy. With CDK, it's not as easy. It's not as nicely abstracted, but it's still possible. So where I started was this book called AWS CDK in Practice. So there's only two books that I know about CDK. One of them is this, one of them is the CDK book. I haven't been through that one yet. But in this one, it is quite all right? So it there's one or two things I don't like about it. So it's 70% there. But in the beginning, it starts with elastic containers in the beginning, right? And then diverges to API gateway scenario towards the middle. I like that later scenario, right? So I did that. But elastic containers, like if you're using containers, usually they're cost effective if you're high scale, or if you're large scale. Otherwise, it can get expensive. So for me, it got expensive, and to learn it, it was okay, but to have it up there all the time, it's not really okay. And it's not really the same as our own technology. Anyway, so it's 70% there, but it's missing something. For instance, in the Lambda functions, it was missing like an update point and then a delete point. So I added those. And it does have a nice web application too. So it does show you how to deploy your single page application to a S3 bucket. But that was also missing those delete and edit endpoints. So I added those two. Besides that, though, the main thing is the temporary stacks, right? So what is enabling that? The things that I added here. The main thing that enables it is this function at get environment config function. I know I double click it, it goes to this MD, but anyway, it's at this infrastructure lib get environment config. So it's right here. So basically, in short, whether you are in CI or whether you are local, if you're local, it uses Git. If you're in CI, it uses GitHub Actions. So if you have another CI provider, you probably need something else here. It gets your branch name, right? And then it has some logic, and this is the only exposed function. If you're in a fixed environment, it will get you that deployment, so environment slash deployment. And then if you're not there, it will get you the branch name. And based on that, it will come up with your backend URL, and it will help you figure out your front end URL. And that gets used. So if we look at this guy, it gets used ubiquitously now everywhere. So the way we utilize it is, let's just look at some of these TS files, like some here maybe. So for instance, when you're building your API gateway with your API gateway construct, for instance, this was built for fixed environments, dev versus prod. Right? That was what's the book about. So refactoring everything to utilize the dynamic environments, that took quite a bit of work. So we're using it here. I think we're also using it right with the S3 buckets. So over here, we get the front end subdomain from the same function. And then later we use that front end subdomain determining the domain name. Other than that, what we utilize is the node. We have to utilize environment variables. Like what I utilize is node and environment variable, and I use that in the scripts alongside all the other constructs. So if we go to, for instance, let's say go to DynamoDB. See, do we have a node environment here? Yeah. So basically this guy. So yeah, the table name is going to be dynamic based on the node environment. And then what we do with that get environment config is we set the node environment too, right? So we kind of mutate that based on the branch name. So then you will see this process node environment in every single um, construct. And that way, we're able to kind of replicate what serverless framework does with a stage parameter, right? So that is the secret. You have to have some environment variable that you're modifying it, and then you have to have a way to get that environment variable, some logic to acquire that. After that, then all that is remaining is how you wrangle this with your local testing and in CI. So Cypress was used for backend testing and front-end testing. And we are again using that function to get the backend subdomain. And then based on that, we are calculating the what would our backend API gateway URL be, right? So we're getting that in there and then setting that as our base URL. We're also using any environment variables. I didn't use any, but this is how you would do it if you needed any environment variables in your test. If you look at the test overview, right, so a nice abstracted command here or a function that can do all sorts of crap. Like, so we post something with some payload, and then we're using Gleb Cypress map to nicely filter things out. And we're using a Spark to verify things like what we added is what we got. And then here we are doing an update, right? We're setting it as completed, and then we're verifying that, and then we're getting it again, and then making sure it's what we updated, and we're deleting it. So when you're testing CRUD, just test, update, and that way you basically go through the whole flow, right? Don't bother testing the other things individually. And in the front end, the web folder, which gets deployed in a S3 bucket, again, we have this script using that function from the infrastructure folder. It calls it infrastructure, but it's not all infrastructure, right? So you have your lambdas in there, and then you have your CDK too. It gets in mix. So I tried to decouple that as much as I could, but I didn't put the lambdas in a different folder because then you have to have all this packages, JSON, everything. Yeah, it's like that's not the point of the repo, right? The point is CDK and temporary stacks. Anyway, we get the backend URL, so we are going to need the React backend URL in the front end application, so we know about where the backend is. So it's used as a pre-built script for that. But more importantly, in the Cypress config file, and we're using only one, we're again using that to get the deployment and then the API URL. We don't really use the API URL, but we still need it. The interesting part is configuring your AWS credentials. But basically, I mean, this one gets intimidating, but it's nicely abstracted. Effectively, what you're doing is you have to initialize your AWS credentials and then write them into the environment variables. After you do that, then that means you basically have permissions to do whatever. You run your test, get your URL, all those good things, right? And then a helper to get your base URL. So it has some logic to figure out, are you on a static environment or a temporary environment? And then after that, based on that, finally, it sets your base URL. Right? So if you are launching your tests, it will tell you, it will console log what your base URL is right now. So right now I'm on main, so it's not going to be anything called main since it's a fixed deployment. It's going to be dev, and I think I have a script for working on stage. So with that one, for stage or production, you have to use the environment variables to identify it. Otherwise, you're going to need to have multiple config files, which is a good practice, but then maybe we're duplicating almost like the entirety of this, right? And then maybe setting this to stage for that one, which I don't really like. I mean, I think it's kind of cool that with temporary stacks and dev, you're using the same thing, and then with stage, you can just pass in an environment variable. On that, looking at the highlights, let me see. So we have that cool thing over there. We're using node environment to replicate the stage parameter. Oh, CI is interesting because so we are using OIDC, OpenID Connect. Basically, it's very secure while giving your CI good permissions to do what you want to do. So basically run your test and deploy. So how does that look at PRs level? I kept it linear just to that Cypress launch over here. So yeah, it will tell you like what's your base URL, what's your API URL, and then run it. Just to demo how that one looks, by the way, I will just run that thing. So this URL will be dynamic and it will go to the dev URL, or it will go to your um, branches URL. So in that case, it's going to be not dev here, but it's going to be a temporary branch, whatever you named it. Right. And if you look at the test too, it is kind of a mirror of the backend API. So unless these are uh, yeah, not really looking pretty, but something maybe I have to install locally. But anyway, I'm not going to install. But effectively, what you're doing is visiting, adding a to do, right? I'm checking in every step. I'm interrogating the backend, and the Sparks using Spark, you'll see that it's kind of similar to the backend test. And then we're editing it, and then saving what we edited, and then we're updating, and again we're checking like every step of the way. We're doing something with the UI, and we're always interrogating the backend. This not only get the status code, which is like you should only be happy with checking the status code if you're running a load test, but if you're doing a real end-to-end test, you should always interrogate the data, and Spark is a super nice, effective way to do that. It's very concise as you see. And then finally we delete it, right? So it's the same mirroring test over there. I was talking about OpenIDC, and so installation, building everything. See, OIDC makes it so that you can just get your AWS credentials easily. I have some environment variables here, so we need your account ID over here to make some of this work. Yeah, and you're assuming a GitHub action role. There are some nodes in there. They're from Yanchu's prod ready serverless course on how to set this up. It's a one-time setup, and then you add your repository where you want this thing to have access to. After that, it makes everything about AWS credentials painless when you're working in CI. But when you're local, you have to kind of handle all those things. And that is this what config AWS for local is. And it only runs if you're not in CI, if you're locally. Because if you're in CI, this thing handles a lot of that. We do our CDK synth. This get branch name is useful for PR, so it knows what our branch is. We don't do the same thing on fixed deployments. Obviously, we know the deployment. We do something else. I'll show you. That's also interesting. And then after we deploy to, and this is basically our deploy script, uh, which is the same thing that we use locally. So when we do branch deploy or just deploy or stage deploy. After we do the deployment, we run the API test. This part's interesting, like getting the S3 bucket, because it's always going to change, right? So we are using AWS CLI, which comes in GitHub Actions. I think it gets pre-installed. But then we have to have these environment variables. There are some security concerns here, but looking into it plenty, I couldn't figure out how to do it. So that's a script that you can even run locally, and we're running it in CI to get our website URL, and then we're setting the base URL. After we know the base URL of our front-end application, we use the GitHub Actions config property to set that. So these are useful for setting your some environment variables that are dynamic. That way, then it runs in CI. The interesting parts in the dev or stages. So I'm using the same thing both on main. So for dev, main or master. So this could be master if that's your thing. And when push the tags, and now you'll see the installation and building is the same, and configuring the AWS credentials as the same. But the one thing you pay attention to is like you have to have these permissions when you're using OpenIDC. This part's interesting when you're dynamically getting the environment variable. So if it is whether it's a you're in dev environment, it will get it will set that node environment to dev, and that means like if you're on main, it will be on dev. If you're doing tags, it will be stage, and otherwise, if you're tagging with prod, you're gonna have to tag a certain way, like prod dash, right? Like when you're tagging it, pushing the tags, name it a certain way, then it will know, hey, this is a prod release. So all these stage and prod releases are kind of done locally, right? You just tag it something and then push it to stage and prod. And then you have your CDK synth and the same deploy. basically, I think it's exactly the same. And my bird is going crazy. I know it's in the other room, but it makes a lot of noise over the headphones. So I apologize for that. Um, Getting the website URL is this is since it's a fixed environment, it's less interesting. So whatever our environment is, it's going to be determined by that. So this price will be dev stage or prod. In fact, these have CloudFormation, uh, CloudFront URLs also, but just to have parity between local experience and the CI experience, I'm using the same thing, and those CloudFront URLs are basically used by users. That's the intention. And getting the base URL is also again from this step, like since it's a little simpler. Besides OpenIDC, let's see if I can use there. Yeah, I mean, I guess that covers all the interesting parts. So as you can see, it's not impossible to do temporary stacks with CDK, but compared to Service Framework, it's actually quite a bit of work, right? And yeah, we can see that PRs are looking good, and then I hope the master is also, yeah, that one's looking good. One other thing that was not very easy to figure out that I shared in a previous video, upon merge, we can identify if the PRs that's getting merged, and then basically we just do the CDK destroy right over here to remove that, and then that same thing. So basically your temporary stack doesn't stay there. That's the benefit. So I'll share this link to the repo, and feel free to try it out. You'll need a AWS account. So I can add all those details here, but yeah, I guess if you're working with AWS CDK or Service Framework, those details are known, and there's enough README, and perhaps I can add some more environment example files just to communicate that, hey, these are the things you may be needing. And they're not being used that much, but I'll just add those there just to make it easier if you want to try this out. So yeah, that's all. Enjoy temporary stacks with CDK. That's an idea from Yantri. He is big on temporary stacks in Service Framework. I just had to try to make it work with CDK, and this is the experiment. I do recommend the book. I think it's 70% there, but you know, you can always take it and try to improve it, and kind of look at this repository to make it like a complete example, which may help you at work if you're using CDK and you're considering temporary stacks. And without temporary stacks, you basically have nothing, right? You have to share an environment, so it's like everyone pushing to a master. Like it's the same thing, like 5 people pushing the master, and then that's a big slow. It's a handbrake on development. And in the absence of temporary stacks, you're gonna have to consider other solutions like maybe you have dynamically provisioned environments, something we're trying to look into, because the more you invest in a CDK, the harder it is to refactor things to make it compliant with temporary stacks. So it's great to start in the beginning, and this is a mid-sized application where you can test things out. That's all.